I'm Dr. Jerica Jordan, an associate professor of English here at Trinity River. It's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for our keynote speaker, Atia Abawi Powell. Ms. Powell is a former CNN foreign correspondent, where she covered groundbreaking stories in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. While in Afghanistan, she managed the CNN Bureau, traveling and embedding with NATO, US, and Afghan forces. Her journalism expertise allowed her to cover the Aung San Suu Kyi trial in Myanmar, as well as the 2011 royal wedding of Prince William to Kate Middleton in London. Powell is also a successful novelist. Her two novels to date are The Secret Sky, a novel of forbidden love in Afghanistan, which was published in 2014, as well as A Land of Permanent Goodbyes, published in 2018. She currently lives in Southern California with her husband and two kids, and she's at work on a third book. So now we're going to show a video that kind of introduces not only Atia, but also her work and her book. So here you go.
A Land of Permanent Goodbyes starts in the summer of 2015 during the Syrian Civil War, which was also the year that Europe experienced the highest influx of refugees since World War II. In this book, we try to use a magnifying glass and focus in on one family and their lives during the war. To research the book, I actually traveled to both Greece and Istanbul to meet refugees living there. Interviewing them was really difficult because in their eyes, I saw what my parents had gone through. But I also saw hope. There were a lot of people who wanted to make a better life for their children, but also the nations that they were going to. I myself was born a refugee. In the early 1980s, my parents escaped Afghanistan during the Soviet War. My brother was 2 years old at the time, and my mom was 8 months pregnant with me. I grew up knowing I was different from everyone, but I was also grateful for the opportunities I received thanks to my parents making that choice to leave for their children. A lot of the stories within the book are real stories because I want to tell people the truth. I want to tell them real stories. I want readers to understand what a refugee is. They are human beings whose lives have been torn apart and are only looking for acceptance. No one wants to leave their home, their families, and their lives. But sometimes in order to survive and to have your loved ones survive, you must. I hope that this book will inspire people to reach out to a refugee, or at least to understand what they've gone through, to open their hearts rather than closing their minds.
Okay, great. So today, as I said, we're going to be able to have a discussion with Atia face-to-face and kind of discuss not only what her book's about, but also the writing process, the journalism process, and other things. Hello, Atia. It's great to talk to you.
Hi, Jerica. It's great to be here. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with you.
I'm so glad to see you 2 days in a row. It's great. So you've been writing in some capacity since you were in college at Virginia Tech, working on interviews, news reports, and even fiction. What kind of gave you the writing bug? What made you want to start writing?
So it's interesting because looking back, I found a little journal I had from when I was 7. And inside that little tiny journal, it was something like, you get in like a Halloween like gift basket or something like that. It was just a tiny little journal. And what I would do is I would get pictures of my friends from school, our little school pictures. And I started taping them into my book and then writing little headlines and little stories about what they were in the future. And the more that I wrote it, the more my classmates would give me their school pictures and were like, write one for me, write one for me. I had BJ, who became a race car driver. I had Erin, who became an actress, and things like that. And I thought that was a lot of fun. And it was always a dream of mine to write a book, but it was also a dream of mine to travel the world. Primarily because of my background, coming from a different part of the world, I wanted to see more of it, to explore, because I knew there was more out there. So growing up, I couldn't decide if I wanted to be a foreign service officer so I could learn languages and travel the world, or a journalist. But in the back of my head, I always had this dream of writing a novel. That dream actually slowly started dying the more I got into journalism, because as a journalist, you have to lose your imagination or else you're not a good journalist. So as my journalistic career kept going forward and I was going to war zones and whatnot, I literally had that dream of writing a novel die. I came to the conclusion that dream's never going to happen. I can put that aside and I don't have to have anxiety or stress over why I'm not making that happen. And luckily I had an opportunity where Penguin was looking for an author who knew Afghanistan, and I was living there for, I lived there for 4.5 years. My background was from there. My parents escaped there when my mother was 8 months pregnant with me because of the Soviet war. So I thought, you know, I'll give it a try. If they like it, they like it. If they don't, I can say that I tried. And luckily they liked it. But again, I lost my imagination. So I approached it as a journalist, and I approached it as writing the truth, writing the things that I saw, the people I spoke to, the interviews that I had, and just combining it into a story. And I think, you know, of all people, that once you get bit by the writing bug, it's hard to it's kind of hard to get rid of it.
Oh, that's great. So you started off with that book in Afghanistan, The Secret Sky. How did this book kind of take shape?
A Land of Permanent Goodbye is the second novel. It was, so I had written The Secret Sky, and my editor was interested in another novel. She said, "Are you interested in writing one?" I said, "Absolutely." And she knew I was living in Jerusalem at the time for my job and my husband's job in journalism. And she said, "Can you write something about the Israelis and the Palestinians?" And I thought, well, this is perfect. I'm living here. It's easy to go interview people. It's easy to get the sights and sounds and smells and feels and be able to write that novel as well. But as I was supposed to be doing the research for that, as we all saw 5 years ago, the explosion of the refugee crisis that was just all over our television screens, all over the world. And I had my infant son with me at the time, and I was holding him in my comfortable, warm, safe apartment, watching other mothers pushing strollers of their children and putting life jackets on babies, getting on dinghies and risking their lives for survival. And I just kept thinking of my parents and the decision they made. And I'm thinking of these parents and the decisions they're making to affect their families' futures. And I couldn't get it out of my mind. And I told my editor, I can't focus on this novel on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when this is all I can think about right now. And I asked her if I could change the topic, and she said, absolutely, as long as you can keep the deadline. So the second that my editor said yes, I booked a ticket to Turkey. I booked tickets to Greece to do the on-the-ground research, because I can't write it from far away. And I think it's a disservice to the people I'm writing about, and it's a disservice to the people who will read the novel if I don't give them the real feel and the real sounds and the real smells and the real views of the refugee crisis.
Yeah, definitely. So do you still have that other book that you're talking about? Is that kind of shelved aside for the future, or have you just pushed that aside for what you're working on now?
It's funny, I have the research. I still have a lot of the research on my computer. I do, but the more I was thinking about it, especially since I don't live there anymore, the more I was thinking that this story is better written by a Palestinian or by an Israeli or by both of them together. Especially because I'm not there anymore. I would have loved to work alongside of them to write the novel. But the research is there, and who knows, it could be incorporated in a different type of novel in the future. Maybe has nothing to do with the same geographical location, but the interviews I had with some of the people there are still really, they had amazing lives, and I'd love to find a way to incorporate it into a different type of novel in the future. I don't know if it'll be exactly about the Israelis and the Palestinians, but it might, their storylines might be present in a different novel in the future.
That's awesome. So going back to A Land of Permanent Goodbyes, which I have read, I thought it was a phenomenal book. One thing I'd like to ask, so you said that you actually did research, you know, as a journalist, you went to Turkey and I presume you went to Syria as well. Can you give feedback on what it was like to actually interview the people that you were using as your primary source?
Absolutely. So just to touch on going into Syria. So Syria was impossible to get into, especially with an American passport at the time. So living, and I thought this was going to be a big disservice to the story. So what I decided to do, and luckily we live in a new era of social media, of telephones, of smartphones. So what I did is I worked with Syrians who were living in Syria at the time, since I couldn't go in. I worked alongside a doctor who was living in Raqqa, which was the de facto capital of ISIS at the time. And he was part of a group of citizen journalists who were trying to get the stories out. So he was really interested in me also telling the story correctly, thankfully. So he did a lot of work to help me out. I found Syrians through social media, and I'd WhatsApp with them, and I'd interview them through the telephone, through the computer, because I couldn't get into the country. But when I went to Turkey and Greece, what I had to do is, because I don't speak fluent Arabic, what in journalism we call a fixer or producer. I hired a fixer in Turkey who helped navigate my research inside of Turkey with the Syrian refugee community. She's currently, I believe she was a young woman then, and now I think she's a journalist for the Washington Post, which was really great to see her rise. And then when I went to Greece, there were also a lot of refugees who spoke Dari, Farsi, Persian, who are from Afghanistan and Iran. So I could navigate that language, but I couldn't, again, navigate the Arabic. So my friend, who was a producer for CNN at the time in Lebanon, I asked her if she could come with me. So she took some time off. She flew to Greece, and she helped do the interpretations in Arabic, so we could speak to the families and the individuals face to face and be able to get their stories together.
Wow, it sounds like you had that really awesome collaboration with just a lot of people that really helped this, you know, come through. I think that's awesome. We're already starting to get some questions. I do want to remind people that are kind of watching at home or on your laptop or wherever that we would love people to ask Atia anything you have about journalism, about writing, or even about interacting with people from different cultures. So our first question, it's anonymous, but that's fine. He or she says, would you say your writing interests are fueled by current events?
That's a great question, and I guess I would, yeah, I would say it is fueled by a lot of current events, because I feel like current events affect all our lives and affect my life. It affects the lives of our children in the future, and I do think it's a very important topics to explain to people. That also said, historical novels I find are just as important because they represent current events and they represent what went about to bring where we are today. So yes, I would say that if the current event has some kind of sway in my heart and mind that I feel like I need to tell the story, yes. So that's what happened with the refugee crisis, with the Afghanistan novel. I felt like I needed to explain to the outside world outside of Afghanistan what the culture of Afghanistan is like, why America has been there for nearly 20 years, why it's the longest war. A lot of people are wondering, why are some wars finished within a few years and others last so long? It's a complicated situation in which, as a journalist, I can't share that in a 1 to 2 minute story or on television or a 750-word article. So I did find it very important to be able to write it in a longer format, diving deep inside for at least the people who are interested in reading about it. Because I know there are a lot of people who don't want to read books about international stories or they don't want to dive deep inside of a story to understand it more. But for those who do, I want to make these books available.
Well, I think that you've done a good job, as you say, like putting someone into an experience that they would never have been able to kind of approach if they hadn't read it in a novel or what have you. I think that's been a great job. So one person that is kind of like piggybacking off that question asks, letting your imagination die sounds so sad, and it resonates with me as an academic. As an English professor, I could totally identify with that too, because we're always told, no, you need to be more analyzing the literature, and you're right, it kind of takes away that idea of creativity. So I really love this question. This person wanted to know, since he or she was encouraged to write critically instead of creatively, how did you rediscover that creative aspect?
That's a very great question, because I feel like I'm still trying to rediscover it. But what I did tell myself is, when I was writing, especially the first novel, where the world was just, there was no color left in here, and trying to find ways to make this beautiful canvas. What I realized is, I'm in Afghanistan. It is actually, I know you don't see this on the news, but it is one of the most beautiful, colorful countries you will ever come across. I mean, the colors of the mountains, I've seen pink mountains and purple mountains mixed in with red mountains and black mountains, and the rivers, these blues that I had never seen before in my life, that are flowing, as you're, yes, in a helicopter, on a military helicopter flying somewhere, you look out the window and you're just blown away by this beauty. And I realized I don't have to make this up. It's there. I'm just going to write what I see. And when you really open your eyes to see the beauty of the world, like just outside the window or whatnot, like you can find that beauty and just write it down. I think that the trouble was trying to re-engage that part of my mind. I guess that's the part of the mind that a lot of children have, where they see things that we don't see. And when I started to open my ears to the sounds and open my eyes to the colors and the vibrancy and the beauty, I quickly wrote it down. Like, I wrote it down in a journal, because I knew I'd forget later, because as soon as something real hits you again, you forget that beauty, and you forget that, and you just focus on the ugly, I guess, the war, the sad stories. And then the second you see the happiness, the second you see the beauty, just write it down really fast. Even when researching the land of permanent goodbyes, at least in Afghanistan, a lot of my stories were on video. And then in between the heartache, I could still see the colors behind. But when I was going to Greece and Turkey, I didn't take a camcorder or anything with me, but there were times that I just turned on the microphone on my phone and I recorded the water, hitting the pier and whatnot, and just listening to the sound so I could listen to it later as I was writing my book.
That sounds amazing. I remember yesterday in your address with Tasha, you were talking about Afghanistan and what it was like before your family left, and like just painting this picture of this country that people have like this idea about, but it was nothing like that, right? So I really thought that was a good way, again, to show people that you don't actually know anything about this country, and I don't know, I thought that was really neat. One thing that Tasha actually is asking, she wanted to know, she says it's obvious that you are an extremely compassionate and grounded person. Yes. How do you keep your emotions at bay when you're covering such heart-wrenching and heartwarming stories?
I'll be honest, it's not that easy to keep your emotions at bay. And there were times where, as a journalist, obviously, I'm going to do my best not to cry on camera. And, I've seen some journalists cry on camera, and they've had every right to. And it's been beautiful to see at times when the stories have affected them. For me, I do my best to try to keep my emotions at bay as a journalist. That said, it doesn't mean that I don't cry at night after a particularly troubling story, even if it happens months later. When you think about it, writing has the same kind of effects on me as journalism, because I approach it as a journalist, because I do my research. There were many days where I shed tears writing A Land of Permanent Goodbyes, because again, the stories are based on real people, real children, real stories. There were times where I had to just close my computer, get my tears out, and days where I just couldn't open the computer back up that day. I'd have to just wait till the next day because I couldn't handle it emotionally and be a parent, a good parent at the same time, because I was doing both. I was writing the book, you know, in my room while my kid was in the living room with, you know, his father. So it depends on the day, but you know, you can't, if you want to be an empathetic person and a person who cares about a story, you gotta let the feelings go through, I think.
Okay. I mean, that's really like the sobering reality of it, isn't it? So we have a break from questions right now. Would you like to kind of take a minute and maybe read from part of your novel?
Yeah, sure. Let me pull it up on my, sorry.
No, it's fine. While you're trying to find a section, I just want to remind listeners or viewers that A Land of Permanent Goodbyes is available at the TCC libraries. We have it available where you can check it out. And then also the Fort Worth Public Library still have it available. I know that's where I got my first copy. So we love libraries. It's also available online on many different places.
This is going to take a minute, so maybe we can go through one question until it opens up. I
Sure.
have it on my phone.
What about your favorite writing experiences? Do you have one that comes to mind?
Favorite? Oh, yeah, it's so funny. So when I was writing my first book, I was trying to write it in Afghanistan, and obviously that's very difficult to do when you're working and you need a break. Then we decided, my husband and I, like, you know, why not on our vacation? Like, you know, we'll take a break. We'll go to Turkey because there was a flight from Kabul to Istanbul. So we went to Turkey. A friend had a house there that he was renting out to people. So he was like, okay, this is going to be a nice little writer's retreat for me. So my husband left. I was like, I have a week and a half to myself to write. And then I found myself in this beautiful house in Istanbul, in the middle of like, it was kind of like he renovated a house in a very old neighborhood. So it was really cool. And I thought I could get writing done. But I realized because I didn't have distractions, I was completely distracted. So there was no internet in the house. I had a little dongle that you put on, like, and it connected to, I guess, the Wi-Fi towers or the cell phone towers. And I found myself going on Facebook, going on social media, going on Twitter, watching TV shows. I'm like, this no distraction is so distracting. So what I ended up having to do is get a taxi, have them take me across the bridge to the other part of Istanbul, go to the busiest street in Istanbul, Istiklal Street, find the Starbucks there, open my computer at a desk there, open it up. And because there were so many people around me, I was too ashamed to open up Facebook or Twitter or watch TV. So it actually forced me to write.
I love that. It's the idea of like that background noise that keeps you going. But I also love how you were like, I don't want people to see me on Facebook. I actually have to do my work. That's great.
Exactly. I was like, oh, I want to see what's going on Facebook. I'm like, oh no, there's 50 people behind me. I'm gonna look studious. So that got me writing. So I found I want to read the beginning, actually, because it kind of introduces the narrator, which is a little different in comparison to my other stories and in comparison to most novels. So this introduces you to the narrator. So here we go. You were born to die, and that I have no say. But when that happens is not up to me, it's up to humanity, and all too often, the lack of it. The human heart is the most complicated creation I've ever encountered. The formation of the cosmos was easier to understand. Yours is a group that is easy to read, yet difficult to comprehend. You chiseled a wheel and transformed it from stone to wood to rubber. You've turned mountains into threads that control machines, computers, and phones. You've even learned to fly without having your own wings. All of this happened within a blink of the universe's eyes. Your greatest achievements came from your brain. Your heart is a whole different system, an intensely more complicated one. It's a place that can hold an incredible amount of love or an incredible amount of hate, sometimes both at the same time. And although there has been ample growth in the capability of your minds, not a lot has changed in the nature of your species. A mother's affection thousands of years ago holds the same warmth it does today, covering her child with a blanket sewn over her soul even long after she is gone. A gentle kiss still sends shivers through the bodies of young lovers, and the memory of that embrace lives on as their bones wither and hair fades to gray. Decades later, you still feel the cold emptiness of losing someone you held dear. But it's the growing divide between the mind and the heart that I find so dangerous for your kind. Your new innovations don't help you feel love as often as they contribute to spreading hate. Your chest is a vault for your jealousy, prejudices, and regrets. Emotions that you once released through sharp tongues and bare hands, until your tongues and hands were replaced with swords and poisons, and now bullets and bombs. The streams of blood turned to rivers and then to oceans. I'm the one often blamed for your actions. Philosophers describe me as the predetermined course of events. I'm sometimes confused with fate or predestination. I consider myself simply the end of a sequence of events that you and your kind actively shape. I don't like to be held liable for the evils in the world, but often I am, through no error of my own. My work is to finalize the deeds of those who have paved their way toward me. I meet you at the end of paths you walk on, sometimes when I truly don't expect to. I'm not the reason why hearts can be so dark. I can't even take credit for the ones who do good. I'm just the end result of your choices. We will always meet time and again. Sometimes you realize I'm there. Other times you ignore me. It's okay, I'm used to it. But even when you stop believing in me or you start despising me, I will never abandon you. I see most of you as old friends. I enjoy when we encounter each other on happy occasions. I weep when the moments are harsh. One thing I ask, please stop condemning me or giving me credit for how, when, and where we meet. That is not up to me. It has never been up to me. I just show up when it's time, and that moment will always arrive. So yes, you were born to die, but in between, you are meant to live. If we run into each other prematurely, it's not because of my negligence, and often not because of yours. Your world controls me. I do not control you. I am destiny.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I really love the line about how the growing divide between the mind, I want to say the heart, what you said, like how the figure of destiny is really troubled by that. And I think that it deals a lot with what we're saying about social justice, especially with the theme that we're in with River Speaks right now as well. One thing, and then I'll get to more questions, it just popped in my head. People were talking about how you might have lost that sense of creativity and how you gained it back. So looking at your book, you know, it's about a young boy named Tarek and his journey to get away from Syria and to get to freedom, basically. Yeah. You talk about destiny is really the one that tells the story. So I feel like did you start with something that was more realistic and then destiny was your way of bringing out and drawing out the creative process?
Yeah, it's interesting, actually, because so my first book is written in first person narrative. So it comes from three different perspectives of three different individuals in the story, the three main characters. So when I started writing this book, I started writing it similarly. I started writing it from Tarek's perspective. it just didn't feel right. So I wrote a couple chapters and I was just like, ah. So then I decided, well, let me try third person. So I wrote it from a third person narrative. And again, it didn't click for me. And I just kept thinking, like, you know, who can tell the story of the refugee the best? And I just kept thinking, is it going to be third person? Is it going to be Tarek? How do I connect with the reader? How do I do this? And then I also kept thinking about, you know, we are all a product of migration. There's no one on this earth who isn't a product of migration, whether it be forced migration, whether it be chosen migration, migration because of war, migration because of famine. It's in our history. It's in our bloodline, whether we remember it or not with our ancestors. But a lot of people forget, and they forget pretty fast as well. Like, I see what's going on today here in America. And, you know, when you see an attack, a neo-Nazi attack, and then you see that it has an Irish sounding last name or an Italian sounding last name. And it baffles me that they don't know that their grandparents were the targets just a few decades ago. You know, my husband, who's white American, his grandmother was a German American Catholic woman. And she was a target of the KKK, blonde hair, blue eyes, but she was Catholic. And we're seeing these people who are now joining the ranks of the people who oppressed their ancestors. So for me, I was just like, how do you remind these people? And I'm like, who knows it best? And then I kept thinking, for some reason, Destiny popped in my head. And I was just like, Destiny can share the story. Destiny can say that she saw this happening, you know, from the beginning of humanity, and we'll continue to see it happening later. So for some reason that popped in my head. I was like, okay, you know what, let's give it a try. I didn't think it would work. And then I started writing the same couple of chapters, and I had those 3 different perspectives. And the one that felt right to me was writing it from Destiny's perspective.
Awesome. I really like that. And you're right, like, you talk about, from Destiny's perspective, about how, like, don't blame me for things that happen. I'm just with you on your journey. And I think that's really good. I mean, because I feel like that's stuff that we all say at least a few times a week, right? Yeah, no, I definitely get that. Well, we're starting to have some more questions come in. One student named Keem, he wanted to know, over the years as a journalist and a correspondent, what would you say is the hardest moment you had to write about? And you definitely have like several years to draw from this. So.
Oh, that's a hard one. I mean, I've had a lot of stories that have been really difficult to cover. And at times you don't even realize how difficult it was until months, if not years later, because you're kind of in survival mode as you're writing it. You're kind of like running on adrenaline. But I will say that writing novels for me has been much more difficult than reporting stories in the moment. Like, I've been shot at, I've stepped on a roadside bomb that luckily did not go off, but you're running again on adrenaline. I mean, you hear the whiz of a bullet, like, was 6 inches away from my face. But I found that less stressful than writing novels, to be honest, because it's so permanent. And since I'm writing about people and about cultures and about situations that affect people's lives, I want to do it right. So because I want to do it right, I put a lot of stress on myself, which I should, because, you know, it's a gigantic responsibility to take on. And the responsibility is to the subjects as well as the readers, because I don't want you picking up my book and not getting a real story. My story might not be everyone's story. It might not be every Afghan story or every refugee's story, but it is a real story from real people that I talk to. So it is somebody's story. But I want to get even that very, very correct. So that's been really stressful, but it's been an honor at the same time.
Great. Well, here's another question. Tasha wanted to thank you for the first response. One thing she commented was that for so long, it seems there's been such a pervasive message that you can't be a legitimate journalist, leader, or what have you, without also being empathetic and compassionate. And she points out that these are really traits that are typically relegated toward the feminine, and they haven't really been embraced as much as, say, masculine figures. But because of that, they're perceived as weaker. What's your comment on that?
Let me see if I got the question correctly. So that empathy is needed or not needed?
Well, she feels like, sorry, it was a very long question from my side. What she was claiming was that leaders should have empathy. However, kind of as we were discussing earlier, a lot of times from youth, boys are expected just to be strong and kind of hold into their emotions, while women and little girls especially are more encouraged to share their feelings. But on the other hand, as Tasha is saying, leaders should be empathetic. Mm-hmm. So basically what she's saying, like, that empathy is perceived as weaker even in men. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's why we are at the situation we are right now in the world today is we have a lot of leaders who are not empathetic. We have a lot of leaders who are not, because they lack empathy, they lack understanding, they lack the desire to actually help people. I mean, just look at coronavirus right now. It's the countries that had female leaders that are doing the best right now. They're working hard to try to understand their people and take care of their people. Unfortunately, when we see a lack of empathy, it's usually people who want power not to help people, but they want power just to have power. They want power because of their narcissism. They don't want the position of power to help. So I think that a lack of empathy in leadership, in journalism, in pretty much every aspect of life is a detriment to every society. This is my personal feeling, and I feel strongly about it. I do think that, and I touched on this yesterday, that, you know, empathy is understanding. Understanding leads to love and compassion. Unfortunately, it's human nature to be afraid of something you don't know. And using empathy helps lead us to love. But unfortunately, a lot of people, what we're seeing today and what we've seen throughout history, and unfortunately, we're going to see this in the future as well, but hopefully we can change it with the masses. But when you are afraid of something and you try to go out of your way to understand it, you pick up a book, you talk to that person that you're scared of. You know, if you're scared of Muslims, you go to a mosque, meet a Muslim, talk to them. If you're afraid of Jewish religion and Jews, go find a Jewish friend or make a Jewish friend, go to a synagogue. You know, you're afraid of Black people, you're afraid of Asians, you're afraid of something that you don't know because it's not you and it's not what you grew up with. If you go out of your way to try to understand it, it's to empathizing with them, and that empathy then turns to love, and it's embraced throughout, and then we can make a better world from it. I do feel very strongly about that, and I do think that this is also the job of us in society to make sure that our boys can also be empathetic, to share their feelings. I know that growing up, you know, people kept saying, boys don't cry, you know, suck it up, suck it up. No, you know, I'm teaching my son, tell me how you feel, express yourself, you know, don't hold in. Like when he tries to hold in his tears, I'm like, if you want to cry, let it out, but let me know what's going on. And I go out of my way to tell my daughter, oh my God, I love how strong you are. I love how, you know, it's a balance. We got to treat them as human beings. Yes, one might be male, one might be female, but, you know, they're the future that can make a difference. And I think it's our job too, as a society, even if you don't have kids, you see other kids, you know, talk to them, treat them as a person, not as a gender.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great. One person is asking, kind of going along with what you're saying about making assumptions about people. Lately, especially on social media, we have these well-researched journalism news stories that have been overshadowed by like these famous personalities and other sourceless opinions. Do you think that this is the new reality? And if so, is there something we can do to change it?
Unfortunately, I've seen a lot change in journalism since I haven't worked for a journalistic organization since I have been pregnant with my son, which was 2014. So when I was pregnant with him, the Gaza war just started and I was living in Jerusalem, and I decided, okay, I'm not going to go into Gaza pregnant. Although it was my instinct to do it, but it was my first decision as a mother. Okay, I got to step back from the war zones for a little bit. So I've been focusing on my children and my writing. And since that time, 2014, I've seen journalism change a lot, and it's been disappointing. Even on the reputable channels, I should say, the focus has become on commentators rather than reporters and objective journalism. And unfortunately, what we're seeing more and more, and it's something that's really blew up in the last elections, was interference. First, it was from the outside interference with fake news stories. And now we're seeing it within our own borders and, organizations that have learned how to do this. And it's terrifying because we are living in a world where information is abundant and we get to choose what we read. And a lot of people choose to read whatever they feel aligns with their minds. Or if they're scared of something, they will read it to reinforce their fear. And again, going back to what I said, fear will oftentimes turn into hate. And it's terrifying. It's terrifying to see.
Definitely. Emily wanted to know, Emily Ariano, how did publishing your first book change your writing process?
Also a good question. So publishing my first book, how it changed my writing process. It was interesting because writing that first book was really difficult in the sense of writing it. The story I knew like the back of my hand. I had been living in Afghanistan. I had been breathing Afghanistan. I had it in my blood, literally it was in my blood. So I knew the story. So that was easy. That was the easy part for me, is the understanding. The hard part for me was getting the words out and on paper and having it written in a way that people can digest it in a novel. And then writing my second novel was difficult in the sense of now I finally knew how to write in novel format, but now I had to go out of my way to do even more research because, I hadn't been living and breathing Syria and living on a dinghy or like living on the coast of Greece. So I had to go there, do my research, and then the painstaking part was to just make sure I had everything accurate factually. That said, it's hard to try to figure out my next novel because I don't know how to approach it. So luckily what I did have is my third book is not a novel, it's a nonfiction book for the Chelsea Clinton series of She Persisted. So that was probably my easiest write ever because it's about a real person with a lot of information about her. Sally Ride, the first US astronaut that made it to space. I interviewed her life partner because she passed away, unfortunately, in 2012 from pancreatic cancer. So I interviewed her life partner. I, read her official biography. There's a Sally Ride Center in the UC San Diego. So I had all these facts, and it was just easy to put down, and it was a short book. So it's for middle grade children. So that was also a lot of fun to do because I knew I was contributing to telling the stories of strong women who persisted and made it.
I'm really excited about that one because my little boy, for instance, who's 6, almost 7, is obsessed with space and space travel. So I think that he'll be really interested to read that, especially from a girl's perspective too, or a female perspective, I mean.
Yeah.
So another student wants to know, what or who inspired you to enter the field of journalism?
You know, it started with the fact that, I was born a refugee. My parents escaped at 8 months old because of the war in Afghanistan. I was born in Germany, came to America when I was 1. But Afghanistan was on the news constantly. And back then, there were 3 main channels for the evening newscasts. We did not have cable, so we didn't have CNN at the time, which I know was available, but not for people without cable. So I remember every nightly newscast we'd watch, and 2 of them were on at the same time. So we'd flip back and forth. And we'd always look for the story because Afghanistan would usually be on the news, if not once a week, twice a week, sometimes the full week. And at a young age, I started watching the news with my parents, and I really was interested in what was going on. But at the same time, I also knew we weren't getting the full story because, again, you have such a short window to tell a story on any of these channels. So I basically wanted to be a journalist myself because I wanted to see the story with my own eyes, because I didn't think we were getting the whole story, and I wanted to know the whole story. It's not necessarily that that I didn't trust the journalist. It's that I knew that I wasn't getting the whole story. So for my own knowledge, I wanted to know it. And then I also trusted myself to be able to share the story as best that I could, rather than, give tidbits and not the most important bits.
Awesome. This is a good comment. People want to know, how many rough drafts did you go through while you were writing A Land of Permanent Goodbyes? And I think that's a good question, because especially with writing students, sometimes, you think you can write 1 draft and it'll be perfect. And obviously we know that's not true. So.
Yeah. Also a great question, because by the end of writing your book and it's getting to the point where it's about to be published, you're completely sick of your book, because you get so sick of reading it. When you're finally done with the first draft, you have a little celebration. Hey, pop open a bottle of champagne, or let me get that scoop of ice cream. This time to celebrate. And then if you're very lucky, which I am, is you have editors, and the editors come back and forth. And that means rereading your book again with their comments and changes and what you accept, what you don't accept. And then you send it back, and then they send it back. And again, you have to read your whole book again with that. And by the end, I do remember emailing my editor, please, God, do not make me read my book 1 more time. I think I read it at least 1 million times. No, not 1 million, but way more than I wanted to in such a short amount of time. I love reading it now again, but when you have to read it every week, a full 200 to 300 pages, you're reading the same thing over and over again and nitpicking over ing or ed, that gets frustrating. So
yeah, it's kind of where the critical part of writing takes over that creative process.
Yeah, and then of course everyone has stylistic, some people like saying walking, and then some people like saying walked. And it's just well, should we do this, and it's the little details, but it's also those little details that make the end result so great. So as frustrating as it is, it's totally worth it.
Oh, definitely. Well, another question that Miranda has is, she says that you've written your novels and the nonfiction book on Sally Ride. She wants to know, do you ever think you'll write your own story? And she mainly, she's asking because with what you've experienced and how you've healed with writing, she thought that your views on empathy and understanding would be helpful for especially readers today.
Oh, that's really sweet. That's kind of you to say. I don't know if I'd write my own story. I don't think there would be a lot of people who'd want to read it, to be honest. And I also, especially at one point someone was like, are you going to write about your Afghanistan experience? And my way of writing my experience was writing the novel. But also if someone wants to read a nonfiction story about a woman's experience in Afghanistan, I would hope there would be an Afghan woman who lives there right now and has been living there the entire time would write that. I always feel like my story is not fascinating enough, and that there's always someone more fascinating out there that could write that story, if that makes sense.
I do. I think also though, like a lot of times we criticize ourselves and our own experiences, but I don't know, it's kind of like when you tell your story to someone you've met for the first time and they're like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. And I don't know. I think people would read your book personally.
That's sweet of you. Thank you.
Another question we have, how long does it normally take you to write your novels? Is it a period of months, a period of years? I know you said like the editing process takes a long time as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the editing process I feel like takes a longer time just because you're working with other people by then. My first book took, it's funny because I think I had about 1.5 years to write it. I can't remember the exact amount, maybe it was a year, I don't know. But when I really calculate sitting down and writing it, I wrote it all in a span of less than 2 months. When you calculate the week I had in Turkey at that Starbucks in Istiklal Street to the couple weeks or few weeks I had when I finally moved to Jerusalem, leaving Afghanistan and just sitting down and writing, when I calculated it all, it was a really short amount of time, but happened in a long span of time where I could actually sit down and write. A Land of Permanent Goodbyes. So since I changed the topic of my book, I changed the topic of my book in January, and the book was due in June. So I had 6 months to do the research and the writing. So that was fun.
That's incredibly just wow. I think that speaks a lot to you, though. I mean, 6 months, it might sound like a long time to people that aren't familiar with the research and writing process, but I mean, that's amazing. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Another question that we have, Myra wanted to know how many books or novels you've written in total, and I know you have 2 that you've published. You're working on the Sally Ride one, and then you have another one that you're potentially shelving for now. Is that true?
So I have the 2 that were published, the Secret Sky and A Land of Permanent Goodbyes. The Secret Sky was also translated into German, which was really cool, and A Land of Permanent Goodbyes was translated into Italian, which was also very cool. I have the Sally Ride book coming out. I contributed to an anthology called Hope Nation, and it was a bunch of YA authors that came together and wrote personal stories, like short stories about something in their life, in hopes of providing young people with hope, especially in times of despair and crisis. I think the woman who, Rosemary Brock, who is from Texas actually, who was in charge of the anthology, she wanted YA authors to write stories to give young people hope, really in the time of Trump. She said that she noticed a lot of her students who were feeling down and depressed, and asked us authors to contribute. So I contributed to that, and I'm trying to figure out my next novel, to be honest. So I'm trying to brainstorm that. I'm actually trying. I know there's been a pandemic and we're quarantined, but that's actually made it much harder to write because I'm focusing on the kids so much that I can't really take a minute to get my brain to unwind and think novel.
Yeah, you're really speaking to like the mom issue, being a working mom, but also staying at home and having to balance everything. I get it. One thing I want to go back to, you mentioned that Hope Nation, those were short stories based on like your own experience. Was that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that what you kind of brought up is a good way just to show like the people watching, especially our students, that, you know, everyone has those stories that, again, are something they can write about and that people want to read. I mean, so I'm just going to segue to TCC for a minute. I guess you can't see that, but TCC's literary magazine, Roots and Reflections, a lot of those stories are just personal stories told from our student base. So if you are watching, if you are listening, if you're a student and you have a story you want to tell, please do so. We can't wait to read those, and we're taking submissions as late as January. So anyway, sorry for that.
Cool.
I just think it's neat because, like, I mean, what you're doing is amazing, but you know, our students also can can kind of get on that bandwagon now. And if they start soon, if they start now, like who knows where they'll be, you know, when they're in our places, right? You know,
right.
I'm not going to say how old we are, but yeah.
I still see you as what were we, 19, 20 in London?
Yeah, no, it was, yeah, oh, London. Anyway.
That was 20 years ago. Oops, I let that slip out.
I know. My 20-year reunion was supposed to be this year. And now everyone knows how old I am. Okay, so next question. Fabian wants to know, based on many experiences you've had in your life, do you have a message that you have to the present day generation? I mean, and when I say that, I mean like the college age generation that could really show how to make the world a better place?
Yeah, I think it starts with you. I think it starts with you and not underestimating yourself. And there will be people who will always underestimate you. There will be people who will flat out tell you that you can't do things. There will be people who will try to dissuade you into doing things and make you feel like, okay, well, maybe I'm not that important. And I say this as experience. I mean, it happens to all of us. I was told by my high school teacher I would never be a journalist. Don't even bother trying. And this was a teacher I had for 3 years of journalism classes in high school. And I'm glad that I couldn't listen to him because I had already declared my major. And as I kept trying to change it, I wasn't able to change it in college. And after a few years, I decided to use that as steam to get me to go on and chug ahead. I think that, you know, I was always told that my, you know, writing's not great either when I was younger because, you know, my speech wasn't great, my writing, my talking, my grammar, because I spoke 2 different languages. And then, you know, you work at it, you get better. And I've always also said that if I could write a book, anyone can write a book. If I was able to make it in journalism at a time where people did not want women, you know, foreign correspondents, let alone an ethnic woman back then, you know, I did it. I did it as a child of refugee immigrants, as an immigrant myself. I think anyone can do anything, but they just have to, honestly, and this is going to sound cliche, but keep persisting and just believe that eventually one day you'll make it. It requires a lot of sacrifices. I mean, when I started my career, my friends were going out after college, you know, the weekends, could go out to the bars, could go out with friends. I was working the weekends, and then my days off, I would go in and shadow another part of the organization to understand all aspects of journalism, all aspects of what made the final product. It takes a lot of sacrifice and it's not always fun, but if you just keep persisting, it's going to happen.
Well, I'm glad that you started talking about that. I know you said that you had a journalism teacher that wasn't great in high school, but did you also, like in college, were you working on like the college TV news crew? Did you have any internships? Can you describe your path to getting to CNN? Because I think a lot of our students, like, they see CNN and they're like, oh my gosh, but as you're saying, like, you didn't get there automatically.
No, and there's a couple things I'll add on, I'll touch on there. So I was not the best student. I wasn't the one who got all the internships in college. I was definitely the one who, like, in college was like, okay, I'll just wait until my senior year. Oh, I'll wait, and you know, I do wish that I would have been smarter and done the internships earlier. I was part of the campus news coverage, let's just say it wasn't the best news show on television, and I chuckle because I remember just how bad I was at it. I then, at the end of this is actually in my Hope Nation anthology, the anthology, the stories in there. But by the end of my senior year, my mom, of all people, was in a fitting room at this place called Lohman's. And Lohman's, it's a communal fitting room. Like, it's designer clothes, but like everyone dresses in the same room. And this woman turned to her and said, "Hey, can you tell me how this looks?" And I was like, "I know you." And she's like, "Oh yeah, I'm on the local Channel 9 TV news station." And I was like, "Oh, my daughter wants to be, a journalist." And so she gave her my mom's card, and my mom said, "Call her, email her." And I did. And she invited me to come to the morning show. And the weatherman there said, "You picked the wrong major." And I'm like, "Oh, great. I'm graduating in a month. Thanks, guy." And then I asked her if she could be my mentor, and she said, "Look, I'm not a good mentor, but I know someone who's a great mentor." And then gave me the information of another news reporter who worked at the local Channel 5 affiliate. And then he's the one who introduced me to two local stations that were cable news channels, like local cable, and said, "Volunteer there." So as my friends were starting work after college, I worked for free as a volunteer reporter at a local station in Maryland. And he even told me, he was like, "Don't go on air until you write 40 news packages. You just take the videos and you write those 40 packages. The first one might take you days. The third one might take you 12 hours, but by your 40th, you can pop out a news script." And he was right. And I did that. And as you mentioned, and this is another thing I wanted to touch on, is I always thought my end all be all would be CNN. Like, I thought this was the dream. And I eventually did get a call from CNN when I guess they got my resume from the file that they had, because I was about to quit journalism because I did not like local news. I was not having fun. And I thought, maybe this is the time to go get my master's. But then I got a call from CNN, and they had the very entry-level position called a video journalist. And that meant printing out scripts, pointing at cameras. I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to give myself 2.5 years. 2.5 years. And then I can say that I tried my best. If I make it, I make it. If I don't, I don't. And in 2.5 years, I worked my bum off. And I gradually, step by step, made it to the position I had always dreamed about, which was a foreign correspondent. And I will say that that was my dream. And it's interesting how dreams can become nightmares because I did not enjoy being a foreign correspondent for CNN. It was not the job. The job itself I loved. I loved being able to tell stories. But I didn't have a great experience with being a young female reporter with management who kept picking on you. And I'm not just talking about the men. I'm talking about female managers as well. They knew they could take advantage of you because you were young. They knew they didn't have to pay you well because you would just accept it. And there were situations where I was risking my life, and I had one woman, I should say, who was always after me from Atlanta. And at one point, I took an online test from a professor in Canada who does PTSD, studies PTSD with journalists. And I took his test, and I had mild depression, I had PTSD, and my contract was up for renewal. And I remember just one of my bosses just being really mean to me on the phone again. And I was just like, I can't take this anymore. Like, this is just stressful for me. And I just said, and I knew it was her way of making sure that my next salary would be really low again. And I didn't care about the salary. I loved my job, but I didn't love being treated this way, and I couldn't do it for another year. So I made the hardest decision of my life at that point, and I decided to say I didn't want to work for CNN anymore. And let me also clarify, CNN's a great organization, and management is fantastic for a lot of people. And I had great experiences in different departments at CNN. It was just this one situation, and they're not there anymore. So I should also add that. But I decided, I was just like, you know what? I'm going to quit. I'm going to figure out what's next. I'm not gonna sign up for anything else. And that night when I told my boss that, I was terrified. I went to bed thinking, what did I do? I just ruined my future. But then the next morning I woke up and I looked in the mirror, and I was only 27 or 28 at the time. I looked in the mirror and I looked and felt like I was 27 or 28 for the first time in 2 years, because before that I felt much older than I was at the moment. And it took a few months, but I eventually found another job and I became the correspondent for NBC there. And again, that revived my dream. So I bring this story up because I want to say that dreams can become nightmares at times, and that's your cue that you need to change something. And it could be a terrifying change because this was my end all be all. And I thought I had ruined my life when I said that, you know, I don't want to move on with you guys. And then that brought along NBC, which was a great organization for me to work with. I know that I've had friends who had problems there. So, you know, again, nowhere's perfect and it's different for different people. My husband's currently freelancing for CNN and he's having an amazing experience with them. Completely new management, different departments, whatever. So just follow your instincts, follow your guts. Life is short. Unfortunately, you learn that more as you get older than you know when you're younger. And happiness is key.
Oh, you're so right. It's like I hear oftentimes people say, well, I'm just happy to have a job. And I get that economically and financially, but sometimes, as you say, like your mental state is just so much more important, especially as you say, like you were talking about having depression and PTSD. And I know many of our students probably deal with that as well. One thing that you were talking about that made me think about your newsreel, there's one where I don't know who it was, so I don't want to, I'm not going to name names or anything, but there was a reporter that after you gave this stellar, like, analysis of what was going on in Afghanistan, he said, well, yeah, look at her then and look at her now. Isn't she gorgeous? And I was just thinking to myself, like, okay, but she's also very smart and also very brave. Anyway, but you handled that well on screen as well. I don't know, it just made me think of what you're saying about like how women are often judged differently. So.
It's so funny because I wonder if that anchor would have said that today post Me Too.
Right? No, that, yeah, because I didn't see the date on it and I was, anyway.
Oh, that was definitely before Me Too. And I should say, though, he was very nice. He was very respectful. He never put me in an uncomfortable situation.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Do you feel like he just meant it as a compliment? But yeah, looking back, I'm like, yeah, that wouldn't have worked today.
Maybe it was something that I wouldn't have noticed before Me Too either, though, you know, who knows?
Yeah.
Well, okay, awesome. So one other thing that I think that we all like to talk about, you know, you've talked about like struggles that came with writing. What's your favorite thing about writing? Like what energizes you about it?
My favorite thing about writing is to be able to share people's stories and get the truth out there. It's the hardest thing about it too, but it's also, you know, it's such a great feeling to know that people have trusted me with their stories and people are trusting me to tell them stories. So that's definitely my favorite thing.
Awesome. Well, here's a good question. This submitter said that his or her brother is writing a novel about his experience and hardships with living in a foreign country. It's probably similar to what you've experienced. And this person says he cannot stop editing and adding to it. How do you know when you've gotten to a point where you've told the complete story and you just need to stop?
That's a great question. For me, it's always been, luckily, deadlines. So if I have a deadline, I need to just get it done and send it. You have to do what feels right. You know when it doesn't feel right. But I do also have a friend who just keeps editing and editing and editing her book, and she's edited it so much that I don't know, it doesn't even represent her first write-up, which was when I read it and I loved it. I think just follow your gut. Just follow your gut, and also keep in mind, short and concise is better. So it's more understandable. It makes the reader want to read it better. You can say more in shorter words and fewer words than in more sentences. So if you think that the point has come across, stop there. Because if you add more, you're going to lose the reader.
I think that's a good thing to say. I mean, that's what they teach you to do in journalism classes, right? And then Ernest Hemingway would have written that way as well. So good footsteps. So I'm trying to think of what else I wanted to ask. Do you have anything from the story? So we have Tarek on this journey because unfortunately there's been a bombing in Syria, and I don't want to go too much into it because I don't want to tell people how the story, I want them to experience it on their own. But can you maybe explain like how you got, I mean, I know you said that you interviewed people, but can you explain where the background for that came from? Why you wanted to put it in that setting, I guess.
Well, I wanted to start it off with showing, showing life the way that it was, even if it's just for a few pages, and then showing the devastation and rubble and explosion and what they live with and what makes them leave. And especially in a place like, say, Aleppo, or a city like Aleppo or whatnot, where, bombs were going off, a lot of people still decided to stay. When the building across from them was gone, a lot of people either decided to stay or had no choice but to stay. A refugee becomes a refugee not because they really want to, they're forced to. No one wants to leave their home and everything they know to go to a place where they know that they're going to be spat at and rejected over and over and over again. So I wanted to show that, here he is in his apartment, and it's not necessarily the safest place because the apartment across the street doesn't exist anymore. But eventually, a bomb hits and everything that he knew has vanished. Like every part of his aspect of his life is no longer in existence anymore, and they need to figure out a way to survive. Sometimes surviving is risking your life and possibly dying is your way of surviving, because if you stay, you're going to die anyway.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just reading that part of the book, it was like right off the bat, and I was just like, did I misread it? And I remember having to go back and reread certain portions because I was like, did I skip something? And I don't know.
Was it the flashback scenes? Is that the one that you're talking about?
It was the one when Tarek is in his apartment, and at first you see him with his family, and then all of a sudden the explosion happens.
Yeah.
And I read really fast, so I was like, did I skim over an important detail? But I think the reason that it struck with me is because it's so vivid, but then also like in experiences like that, you can't always make sense of what happened. So that's kind of what I got from it. I don't know if that's what you meant, but.
No, it's absolutely what I meant. And it's interesting because I had one editor who's like, yes, I really like it. And another editor who had the same kind of reaction, like, could it be a little confusing for the reader? Do you want to take it out? And I was like, no, I want to keep it. I want to keep it because that's what happens, when you go through a life-changing event, and it doesn't have to be an explosion. It doesn't have to be a bombing. It could be someone you love dying. It could just be cancer. It could be a car accident. It could be anything. Like when your life changes, that moment it changes, it'll never be the same again. And you have these moments where you dream or you think of the normalcy that was, but then you're ripped away from it again when you're ripped back into reality, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I think, there's a lot there. Like if you're interested in psychology, there's a lot about like the stress response and as you were saying, like how everything just kind of takes over and you have to make decisions at the spur of the moment, that kind of thing.
Adrenaline is something in our body that is there for a reason.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes me feel good that like I definitely interpreted it the way you meant to. Yay. Okay, so some other questions. One person wanted to know what has been the most interesting change made to your story through the translation process? Because you mentioned that one of your books was translated into German and then another was translated into Italian. And it's fascinating that people in other parts of the world are looking at your story so closely.
So I haven't been able to read the translations because I don't read German or Italian. So I am very curious myself, but I know that these are distinguished publishers in both countries. So it's DTV in Germany, and I'm not going to pronounce it correctly in Italian. Giunte? I'm sure my friend could do it much better. But there was a friend of mine who's Syrian Italian. Her father is Syrian and her mother is Italian. So she can read that and the English, and she helped me a lot. She's in the acknowledgments in the book. But I'm curious to know her interpretation if she reads the Italian one as well. But they're both from very reputable publishers, and I know that the translators that I know that the translator they use in the German one is someone that they use for a lot of books, and I'm sure the Italian one is just as good as well, because I've gotten a lot of great feedback from Italian readers. So it's pretty cool to hear from Italian readers in Italian and try to translate what their comments are on Instagram or Twitter. It's pretty cool.
Do you know like what the largest reading base for your book is? Like, do they do statistics on that?
No, I don't know that, but I can tell you from the feedback I've seen on like Amazon and Goodreads, it's pretty cool to see that with YA. What's great about the YA young adult industry is, yes, they target it to young adults, but really what they're targeting is young adults and wanting their parents to pick up the book too. So I've gotten a lot of feedback from parents who've really like connected with the book. I mean, the one that made me chuckle was on Amazon. It was a 50-something-year-old man who said, "I bought this for my my middle schooler, and it was too much for her. And then I bought it for my high schooler, and she was just like, yeah, okay." But then I read it and was like, I loved it.
I like that, because oftentimes I feel like, you know, I want to return to the young adult stuff too, you know. But one thing that I appreciated about your book is that you mentioned this about how when you're a child, you have like that spurt of creativity and you think about things so differently. However, a lot of times when we're reading, we have young adults or children who are obviously, their stories are being written by adults or being told by adults. So did you find that process difficult and like, in a sense, like translating your book through the mind of, say, a 15-year-old? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I used to always think like, you know, we always talk about cultural appropriation, but what about age appropriation? You know, and this is something like with the YA industry, a lot of these YA books are written by adults. And some of them like I'll read and they're really good and they connect with me because I'm in my age group, but they'll bring up stuff that culturally we would have known in the 90s, you know, or early 2000s, that I'm like, I don't know if teenagers today would get this. But I'm lucky in the sense that in Afghanistan, in Syria, I'm not really like, these stories are so, I guess, intense that I don't have to put pop culture references in very much. And if I did, something that I've been made fun of and will continue to probably be made fun of is I still consider myself, I'm still into kid things. Like I still love, you know, music that teenagers love. I was in Afghanistan and I got embarrassed for a second, but looking back, I'm like, whatever. But back then I was embarrassed. I fell asleep on the couch in our bureau. Like the bureau had an office, it had the people's bedrooms, and in the middle, a living room. And I was watching television in the living room and, you know, I saw no one was around. So I just turned on the Disney Channel and I was watching like, I think back then it was Witches of Waverly Place. I remember watching it and being like, and then I fell asleep on the couch. And the cameraman walks in and he's just like, what the hell is this? You know? And I was like, oh my God.
So comforting about that, you know, like, cause I mean, especially you were in a war-torn like environment. And so sometimes like not only watching something from America, right?
Yeah.
But then also watching something it's not life and death. It's just.
Thank you for getting it. Thank you for getting it. And I was the only one who permanently lived there. So the cameraman would come for like 4 weeks at a time. So they didn't need that escape. But I do remember being like, oh, someone must have changed the channel. Watching the news.
All right, let's move on to another question. One person says that they really like writing for entertainment, which is another great thing to do. And she says that a lot of people tell me that my writing is good and that I should publish, but I'm never satisfied. I feel like my art is good. So I guess what they're trying to ask is that common to feel like your writing isn't good enough? And how do you get over that feeling?
You will never be satisfied with your own writing. You will never be satisfied with your own work. I still, like, when I read my books, I wish I would have done it this way. I wish I would have done it this way. And it's already published, so I can't really change it. You will never be satisfied. Your work is really good. Your friends are saying it's good. People are reading it. You know, just go out there and try to, you know, send it out to people who will publish it. Try to find an agent. Try to, if it's short stories, try to get it published in a magazine, as you were mentioning, the TCC magazine. Just get out there and publish it. Put it on your own website, you know, get your name out there, put it out. I wish I could follow the advice that I'm getting. It's my husband who's the one who's pushing me to like publicize my work and whatnot. But just do it. Just do it. You will never be satisfied, ever. And it goes back to the last question that you had where they just keep editing and keep adding. Like, just get it out there.
I know it's really hard because it's an artistic part of you, a creative part of you. It feels like they're judging you instead of your writing, I think. So yeah. Do you feel like you have to kind of like separate that or like, I don't know, desensitize yourself to it?
It's hard to desensitize yourself. You know, it's just, it is what it is. I mean, there are a lot of times where I just didn't want to write either novel because I was terrified of the reaction from some people. And there will always be someone who hates it. There will always be someone who loves it. The people you think will love it will hate it. The people you think will hate it will love it. It's just something that you just, and it's easier said than done. I get it because I know it. But it's just something that you just have to just deal with.
We have another question. I think you've kind of already touched on this, but maybe you can add a little bit more. Disha wanted to know what your favorite part of the writing process was and why.
My favorite part is actually finishing.
Yay!
And, my favorite part is definitely finishing. I also enjoy the research. As painstaking as it is, as much as I also don't enjoy it, I do love learning more. There's just something about learning new things that you get excited to share by putting it in your writing that I also enjoy as much as I find it stressful to do the research part.
So you mentioned earlier about having to leave your quiet, alone space and go to a very crowded Starbucks to get yourself to write. I totally identify with that. Can you talk about like if you have like a typical writing time or like setup that you have to have? For instance, I know a lot of my students, they say I cannot write at home because I've got brothers and sisters and they're constantly asking me for help. But then I have others that say, you know, I mean, as you say, like I have to have music on or something like that. Like for me, I would listen to the Jane Eyre soundtrack to get me going. Anyway.
Yeah. So I would say what I would do is if I was writing from home, I would put on my headphones and there was a website. I'm wondering if it's still there, but it was basically just cafe sounds.
Okay.
And I would put that on. I would go to, when I was in America, my favorite thing was going to public libraries. I love just going to a public library, finding my little desk and writing, because you don't have to worry about really also the distraction of people and like possibly like feeling guilty that you haven't bought a cup of coffee in a while or something like that. But you also have the people around to keep you in check, to make sure you're not on Facebook or watching a movie on your laptop. But yeah, if I was doing it from home, which when I was in Jerusalem, you know, there was a cafe that I'd go to every once in a while. But I always had the room that I would go into. I'd close the door, I'd put my headphones on, and I'd just turn on this website that had cafe noises. And it was just the tinkle tankle and the hearing the dishes, you know, being washed or whatnot, that just could kind of get me in the mood to write.
Awesome, thank you. Here's another question. Have you set up any personal guidelines regarding your willingness and or the frequency by which you read reviews of your book?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. It has to do with not personal criticism, but like criticism from other people, book critics, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Tasha wants to know if you've set up any guidelines regarding your willingness to read book reviews, or like how often you search for book reviews, that kind of thing.
So I definitely go on Amazon reviews just to see what people are saying. I go to Goodreads as well, especially in the first year or two after a book is released. The criticisms can hurt, they can sting, but then it's also nice to see the people who have good things to say. So I try not to let it get to me. Mainly because people are, for the most part, nice, and everyone, you know, readers, especially readers who go out of their way to write reviews on Goodreads, are critical readers. So they know what they're looking for, they know what they like. But I do like getting the reviews, because the more reviews there are, then I know people are reading it. And I know that reviews also help with having other people wanting to read books or not. I go to reviews when I want to buy a book. I'll go online and look at the reviews first, just to see what people are saying. I take the bad ones and the good ones all with a grain of salt, but I think you can get a good overview of if a book's going to be readable or not. So I actually really appreciate all the reviews, including the bad ones. Like, I mean, by bad ones, I mean the ones who didn't like the book, because you know, some of it's constructive criticism that you could probably look into for your next book and see what they mean by that. And others can be really personal. So you know that they're coming from their own mindset in life, that you know, there was one review that, I mean, she just wanted Tarek's family to be more religious. And I was just like, oh, that's kind of weird. She gave me a 1 star because you didn't like that Tarek's family wasn't too religious. So I thought, okay, that's personal. So you know, that's her personal point of view, and I respect it. But I wouldn't use that as constructive criticism next time, because it's just the way I wrote his family, you know?
I think that's interesting, because oftentimes I'll read a book, and depending what mood I'm in, I think this is the same with TV and movies too, but depending what mood I'm in, it will give me a sort of perception about the book. And then if I had read it in a different, I don't know, period in my life, I would have either appreciated it more or interpreted it differently.
You know, I think you hit a nail on the head with that, because I remember there were certain comedies I didn't enjoy when I was in Afghanistan. Like, I would watch television to escape as well as read. Reading, I was reading more nonfiction back then, because I was in the mindset of gotta know what's going on in the world. But then I would watch television to escape, and there was like these comedies that I was just like, I remember my husband was just like, oh, they're so funny, you should watch it. I'm like, eh. And since coming back to America, or even when I lived in Jerusalem, they're like my favorite shows now. And I'm just like, how did I not find this funny back then? It was different points in time, you know. I might not find it funny in 10 years, but now it's like my favorite. It's my escape.
Do you have any examples?
Yeah, what was it? Curb Your Enthusiasm. I remember in Afghanistan, like, he's just a curmudgeon. I don't like this. You know, why is he so pessimistic? And then a few years later, I was watching it in Jerusalem. I'm like, oh my God, I love him. He's me, except he's just saying everything I want to say. I want to even say Veep. I remember not finding it that funny in Afghanistan. And I think now it's one of the best comedies that has ever been on television.
She is a national treasure.
Oh. But it goes to show you what my depression PTSD was in Afghanistan, that I didn't think it was funny then. And now I think it's one of the funniest shows that was ever created.
Yeah, no, it was really good. I'm trying to think of what else. So going back to the idea of social justice, especially, you obviously look at a lot of different themes in your writing. With Sally Ride, for example, a lot of people may not know this, but she was a member of the LGBT movement as well, right? And a lot of people don't know that because it probably wasn't publicized in, 1980 or in the 1980s when she was an astronaut, right? What other kind of themes or issues are you trying to talk about in your writing, and can you speak to their importance?
So, well, that's interesting that you bring up Sally Ride and her sexual orientation, because she never brought it up. So, like, and I say that, like, no one knows about it because she didn't tell people. She was very secretive about it, and I learned this researching her. She was very secretive about her relationship. Her and Tam O'Shaughnessy were life partners. They had known each other since they were kids, but they only got together as adults. But she also had a girlfriend in college. She also had boyfriends in college. But it was something that she never touched on. And I actually thought about this when I was writing her book. I was like, do I make this a big part of her book or do I not? Because it's huge in the sense of, as the LGBT community, like, they have a woman who was the first U.S. astronaut in space, she was also the first LGBTQ in space that we now know of. So when I was writing the book, I'm like, do I focus on that or do I not focus on that? And I found it very, like, a sensitive topic to decide, because she didn't focus on that. I ultimately decided she wanted her focus to always be on her accomplishments when it comes to NASA and to space and her work in science. I mentioned Tam as her partner and, the love of her life and this and that, but I don't say she was the first, lesbian who, made it to space. Instead focused on her accomplishments as a scientist and a physicist over her sexual orientation. Because I was thinking also, like, would I go out of my way to say she was straight and married and this and that? Because I didn't mention her marriage, really. I didn't really go into her personal life like that. I did at the end talk about her and Tam and their partnership, life partnership, but also their partnership in science, because Tam O'Shaughnessy was a biologist, and clearly Sally was astrophysicist. So they worked together in exploring the science of the Earth as well as science of space and sharing that with children. But I didn't make it a whole chapter on, and it was a tough one to decide, to be honest, because I think it's a really cool thing, but at the same time, I was thinking, how would Sally have wanted it to be written,
I think that's really an important point, because it's kind of the idea where people will say, well, this was the first female something to do something, and then you're like, okay, but can't we just go back and take the female part out? Like, can't the accomplishment just stand on its own without this person having to be the first Latino person to do this, the first Black person to do this, the first female, or what have you? So I think that's a good comment to make, what you're saying in your book. Another question that students have, it's a two-parter, so I'm sorry if it's lengthy. How do you disconnect your personal beliefs from things that you write about? What advice would you give to others struggling with this, either in their writing or in their reading of others' work? I think that matters a lot, like especially in present day.
That is a good question. And I think separating your personal belief doesn't have to mean separating your empathy. So just connecting with them on a human level and expressing their story on a human level is a connection that we can all have. But I think it's not that difficult to do when you have that empathy and you know you're just trying to tell their story. I hope that helps. I know that, like, for instance, there are a lot of people who like can be. I don't think an Islamophobe should ever write a book about a Muslim, if that makes sense. But if you're a Christian or if you're Jewish and you want to have a Muslim character in it and you empathize with that character as a human being, you could definitely write that character, you know, do the proper research, do the understanding as a human. I don't think someone who's a neo-Nazi can do that, but I think that someone who can empathize can. I hope that helps.
No, it does. I mean, it goes with what you've been saying all along, both yesterday and today, about looking at individuals, as like people with feelings and emotions and that kind of thing, and not looking at their appearance, you know, or as you say, like their sexuality or something like that. Those things are, well, important. They don't like comprise the entirety of the person.
Exactly. Like if you're gonna have a Black character,
mm-hmm.
You know, unfortunately, what we've seen a lot with people writing about people of color, including Black characters, is suddenly the story becomes about them being Black or them being Asian or them being Muslim, and we tend to forget the humanity. Like, okay, that's a feature, but they're human, so they have the same thoughts, feelings, you know, what is it that's going on in their heart and mind, not what shade is their skin.
Yeah, definitely. Well, can you tell us some of your favorite writers? Like who are you reading, and who do you think is doing a good job with this idea of social justice?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I feel like I keep looking at, say, for instance, Ibram X. Kendi's work. And I follow him on social media. I like his idea of, for instance, being anti-racist versus being not racist, and the difference between those two things. So
I like opening it up to just reading as many books from as many different authors as possible. I don't just buy. I mean, clearly, if you like the author, you're going to keep buying their books. But I also like to open it up to other authors, because I know, as someone who hasn't sold millions of copies of my book, that my book has reached certain people. So a book doesn't have to be a bestseller for you to connect to it. So I definitely go for, like, you know, the book, those books as well. Clearly, the ones that are the bestsellers, because they're bestsellers for a reason. But I also try to open it up to topics that I might be interested in. And I think diversity is a huge one for me. And that's mainly accessible in the YA industry. I think the adult industry is still kind of lacking in a diverse audience. And I do feel that the YA industry not only has diversity in books, but the diversity in authors, and the authors have found unique ways of telling stories about race. They've incorporated real life with fantasy life at times, which is pretty cool. I like realistic fiction, and I like nonfiction too. I love reading the truth. I love reading historical fiction to understand why we're here today, and really why we weren't taught whatever we're learning in a book now in school, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, things are a lot different now, the stuff that they're reading. And I think that it's really important. It's shown how much we've grown in our perspectives. Another question from our TCC community, in working with refugee youth, their identities are often so stripped from them and remolded out of necessity, perhaps to fit in or assimilate. What impact do you think is possible through the publication of young refugee stories and the celebration of their voices?
That's a good analysis, actually. A lot is stripped when you try to assimilate, and I say that as someone who had to assimilate growing up with one culture in the house and one culture outside of the house. Maybe it's not completely stripped from them as much as they're just like, I'm grateful for the way I grew up. I wish there were some changes. I wish there was some more acceptable ways of people accepting my background and culture from my home into the school. And I think that today that's possible in a way that it wasn't back then in certain areas, but not in other areas. And I mean geographical areas as well. I think that encouraging these young people to tell and share their stories as well is important. When I got to go pre-COVID, I got to go to Iowa. My book became an all Iowa reads book. I got to travel to different places in Iowa, including a place called Columbus Junction, which is a really small town. And I was curious to know how my book, resonated with the students in Columbus Junction. When I got there, I didn't realize that Columbus Junction, despite being a very, very small town in Iowa, was also home to a Tyson's chicken factory. So there was a lot of immigrants that lived there. And what one of the teachers had done was they had them read the book, and then they had them do a project where, they drew pictures, and then they wrote pieces of the book that they liked, but also how they connected with it. And a lot of these children were children of immigrants who were working at the Tyson's factory, some of them undocumented. And reading their stories was just so amazing. And talking to them, because they also told me, this was the first time they felt like they could express their stories. And reading it and being able for them to share their story just, opens the eyes of their, classmates who might not have known their full story or might not have cared, to be honest. So I'm almost forgetting the question now, because I'm just thinking about basically encouraging them to tell their story, encouraging for them to open up and share their story, and letting them know that their story is accepted, that they are accepted as they are, would be a great thing to do.
I think that also ties into the theme of empathy, because so you said you've read a lot of diverse novels from a lot of diverse perspectives, right? So, I mean, I like to do the same thing to learn more about other people, other cultures, etc. But I mean, from your novel, from other books that we've referenced, at heart, it's still that same person trying to figure out, his or her safe place, or his or her like falling in love, or being able to tell the truth about themselves, that kind of thing. I mean, that is a common experience, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. And I was actually lucky, because I lived overseas for so long, going through international airports, picking up books in those airports that were translated into English, but told the story of that particular country, a story from that country, that you couldn't always find at the bookstores here in America, or even online. If you go, like, the bestsellers list isn't going to have Last Train to Istanbul, or just different stories that could be bestsellers in a different country, and then they've sold so well that they have been translated in English, but they didn't become bestsellers in the UK or America, but they're selling it at the airports there. So, like, I was very lucky in that. And I think it's important. It's important to read the stories from around the world and just have that connection.
I have that book on my Kindle, by the way. I need to read it.
Someone took my copy in Jerusalem and never gave it back.
Did you like it?
This is the worst part, is I was almost finished with it. And then I was like, it's okay. They're like, I really want to read this. I was like, go for it. But you know what? Now I will download it on Kindle as well.
One really cool thing that Amazon does every year is like World Reads Day or World Reads Week. I'm not trying to hype Amazon, but this was cool. They like will release like 8 books that have been published by international authors, and you can download them all for free on your Kindle within that time period. And so I've been able to read books that were published in Spain, or as you say, like that book, The Last Train to Istanbul or whatever.
Well, you got to let me know when that happens again.
I will. Yay, Instagram, social media. I'll send it. Okay, so I think that we're going to wrap up here in a minute. Wait, we have one last question, if that's okay. Miranda asks, you have talked about your dual foreignness and how you have felt that you didn't fit in either. You've also mentioned being pregnant in Jerusalem. Were your children born in the US or abroad? And then if not, can you share some of those experiences? Have they also felt that they are a dual foreigner?
Good question. So I was pregnant with my son in Jerusalem. I made a point in coming home to give birth to him. My husband joked it was to make sure that he could have a chance to be president. But for me, it was so I could be near my family and also not be in a hospital where I didn't speak the language, and didn't know what was going on. You know, Jerusalem could be very politically divided as well as racially divided at times. And, you know, later on I had a really bad experience with a miscarriage, and I went to the hospitals there and they did a great job. But of course, you know, being pregnant at the time, I was also worried about that, you know. So I just wanted to be close to my family and close to my mom to help me for the first few weeks of my child's life. And I think he was 7 weeks old when I brought him back to Jerusalem, and he spent the first 3.5 years there. He was 2.5 when I put him into a preschool because he really wanted to be around other kids, and he started learning a little bit of the language there. He was supposed to learn both of the languages, but the Arabic teacher, they were short on cash, so the Arabic teacher did English and the Hebrew teacher did Hebrew, so he learned a little bit of Hebrew. You know, he was too young to really realize the difference. Like, you know, he knew that he wasn't the same, but he also, you know, he had my husband's looks, which was, you know, blonde hair, blue eyes. And there were a lot of kids in his classroom that looked of all different colors and shades, to be honest. It was pretty international. That said, it's funnier because he spoke great Persian, like Dari. Like I would speak to him, and my husband learned a little so he could learn my family's language. It was when we moved back to America that actually changed, which was actually pretty surprising. I don't know if it was because he was immersed in English way more than he was in any other language. But now, for instance, when I speak to him in Persian, he'll respond in English. And I've even asked him, I'm like, why don't you just speak to me in Persian anymore? And he goes, I don't speak Farsi. And I'm like, and then I'll respond to him and he'll understand what I said. I was like, see, you understood everything I just said. And I am worried that he's losing it. And I'm worried if he loses it, that means my daughter's not going to gain it either. I want them to know my background and have a connection to it. I don't know if they're going to feel different growing up, but they might. And in a way, I hope they do, because if they feel different, they're going to realize that everyone is different and be able to treat everyone with respect. Last thing I want is for them to think that there is only one way of being, and that way is the only way, and then them to take it out on others who are different. So I want them to know that they're different. I don't want them to be those people that I was talking about earlier who forget about just a generation before how their ancestors were persecuted, and now they've become the aggressive attackers. And I want my kids to know that they're different. It's a blessing to be different. We're all different. And to pretend that we're not is to be a disservice to ourselves, to be honest.
Definitely. Well, I've seen your 2 children and they're precious.
Thank you. So are
okay.
you.
Thank you. Well, I think that we've had like a really great discussion. As always, I'm so glad that I got to catch up with you. I can't believe the last time I actually saw you in person was
18 years ago.
Well, I wasn't going to mention it, but yeah, we'll have to do a reunion sometime. Maybe in LA instead of London, although I would welcome both. So are there any other like last words or final things you'd like to give to the people watching this from home?
I just want to say thank you for taking your time out of your life to listen to me. I hope that I in some way may have helped answer any kind of questions you may have had. I hope I did not waste your time, but I do appreciate your time. I know it's very precious, so I'm honored that you spent it with me. And thank you, Jerica, for being able to ask such amazing questions as well and bringing me to TCC. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been wonderful. It's been great. I want to thank Jeanette Laredo for setting all of this up. And obviously to Tasha and everyone else at the Writing Center. So one last thing I want to mention, if you are watching or viewing, we would love if you could visit the URL in the chat room and just give us your feedback. Tell us what you thought, if you enjoyed it. We just want to know so that we can continue to do this in the future. Again, last not least, if you want to read Atia's book, A Land of Permanent Goodbyes, please do so. Like I said, you can get it at libraries, you can get it at, well, on Amazon, or you could get it, you know, just in your local indie book stores. Those are great too. And what?
And leave a comment and review.
And submit. For the TCC Literary Magazine, we are taking submissions of writing, of art, anything that you have to contribute. We would love to see it. And we are going to be taking those up until mid-January. I know there are some great writers, great artists out there, and what better time than to submit than now. Anyway, thank you for letting me do that. But again, Atia, you're amazing. You're wonderful. I can't wait to see what you're going to come out with next. And thank you for everyone who came to listen. We appreciate all of you. We hope you all stay safe and have a wonderful Halloween, everyone.